Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today we're talking with Admiral James Stavridis. The Admiral is the author of numerous works of nonfiction and also 2 novels. During his military career, he was commander of the U.S. Southern Command, commander of the U.S. European Command, and he was the NATO Supreme Allied Commander from 2009 to 13. His latest book is the novel 2054. This is speculative fiction. The title is a reference to the year 2054, and there's nobody in a better position to tell us all what's coming down the pike than Admiral Stavridis. Admiral, it's an honor to have you here. Thanks for coming in.
Doug, it's great to be here. You know, you use the term speculative fiction, which it certainly is. I reject the term predictive fiction because I'm not predicting these events, but ultimately, I think it's a work of cautionary fiction. In other words, we still have time to kind of reverse engineer it and avoid some of the challenges that we lay out in 2054.
Well, and it's clearly deeply informed by your sort of incredible experience of seeing what's going on and probably seeing predictive classified reports from which you then have some fun in fiction.
Exactly. And, you know, I get asked a lot, well, why did you start writing fiction? Because I wrote 10 books of nonfiction, a lot of history, geography of the oceans, maritime. But I turned to fiction, Doug, because exactly what you say, you shed the straitjacket of footnotes and the nonfiction world where you're so under the gun to get everything precisely right, and you really get to splash some paint around the canvas.
Oh, that's fun.
And I've loved it.
Well, I'm delinquent in getting the cocktail in your hand. I love your choice today, the Negroni. So I'll get that fixed up. And, you know, normally, as I mentioned to you as we were off air, that I start typically with your early life and work forward. But before I do start with your early life, I wanted to ask you to confirm or deny something that I read, which is that on the one hand, you were vetted by Hillary Clinton as a possible running mate. And on the other hand, you were also vetted by Donald Trump as a possible Secretary of State. Is this true?
It is absolutely true. I was vetted for vice president by Hillary, one of 6 people actually vetted. And then, truth be told, I was actually offered a cabinet post by Donald Trump. I think of that, Doug, as 2 bullets whizzing by my head at really close range. So I very happily said, nope, I'll continue to comment, but not from inside the administration.
Well, that is a spectacular feat of crossover appeal. Had you been asked, would you have felt the responsibility to say yes to either of these?
No. I felt as though I had served the country at that point for 37 years in uniform. And during those days, I was the dean of a law school, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And I was very happy with continuing a life of service in education at that moment in my life. So I think it's unlikely that I would have accepted a position in either administration.
Okay. Well, and you also are serving as writing terrific fiction and nonfiction books. Cheers.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. You make an excellent Negroni. I noticed you did that by eye, which is good. Do you know what a boulevardier is?
Sub in the whiskey, the bourbon for the gin, right?
Yeah, that's
those
my winter drink. Now that we're
gin in the summer,
correct? Gin, a Negroni in the summer, and in the winter a boulevardier, which I think is one of the great names.
It is a great
cocktail.
name. I love those drinks too. I'm same. I'm more gin, white wine in the summer, and red wine and bourbon in the winter.
Correct.
So.
Do you ever drink scotch?
Not, I've got to save something for old age.
Yeah, I have probably 40 single malt scotches in the house, and on the right kind of evening when it's really cold outside, I'll get out a great smoky, peaty scotch like a Lafroig or an Ardbeg. But I think you've got it right. Wait until you're old enough to have an aged basset hound at your feet and a crackling fire and pull up alongside. Yeah.
I think my main problem with scotch actually is that there's a certain amount of volume. I don't know if it's a nervous habit or something, but I sip a lot and a lot goes down in scotch. If I had scotch, it would be a short night for me, I think.
Yeah, I always say about scotch, it's 1, 2, 3, floor.
All right, so thank you for confirming the Hillary and Trump things that I read. Now, you were born in West Palm, Florida?
I was. West Palm Beach, which is right next to Palm Beach, but it's the quintessential other side of the tracks. Palm Beach is where immense wealth is. Where I was on the other side, actually, of the intercoastal and the tracks, West Palm, in those years, this was in the late 50s, was a working town, and my dad was a young officer in the Marine Corps stationed down there running a recruiting station, which is how I happened to be born in South Florida.
Okay. Well, I think it's gotten nicer over the years. I did some work down there.
It's beautiful
at PGA
now.
Nationals there, and I guess Palm Beach Gardens right nearby.
It's absolutely beautiful now. Yeah. And that is a testament to a strong economy in the south of Florida.
Yeah, Florida's booming. And were you thinking of a military career even early in those days?
Yes. From my earliest age, I remember being the son of a Marine officer. My father was a combat Marine in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He eventually retired as a colonel, very proud colonel of Marines, as we say in the business. And I went off to the Naval Academy, from which you can become either a Marine officer or a Navy officer. And I went there thinking, I'm going to be a Marine just like my dad. And then I went to sea for the first time, and I just fell in love with the ocean. And my dad was extremely displeased with that. And he finally got over it like 22 years later when I pinned on my first star as a Rear Admiral.
Well, I imagine that would. But don't the Marines see some naval action?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. They're sea soldiers. We often say they come on our ships and they are discharged from our ships generally into amphibious operations. And there's
that's a Jackie Fisher line. As you and I were
totally
just the Army is nothing but a projectile to be fired on the land or something like that, right?
Exactly right. And Marines are the precision-guided version of that analogy.
They're the smart missiles. And throughout, you have really valued education. I think it was during your years of service you got a master's and a PhD.
I did.
How does that work when you're in active service? How do you manage advanced education and degrees and things like that?
Actually, all of the armed forces carve out 2 to 3 years fairly early in the career of officers, and they make graduate education possible. And you can apply to attend a civilian graduate school, as I did, or the armed services have their own graduate schools. And so I chose to apply for civilian graduate school. I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, did a master's and a PhD there, and became kind of a strategic planner. And so it was paid for. It was a wonderful time of life, and we enjoyed living up there. And to close the story, I got my PhD in '84, and in 2013, when I concluded my service as Supreme Allied Commander, they asked me to become the dean, and I served as dean for 5 years.
I wanted to ask you about that because that's such a topic in the news, and this is not that political a show, so this is about as political as we'll get, and just in this moment here. But I wanted to ask you about your time because academia, of course, has a reputation of being far more ideologically left than the population at large. Did you find that to be the case?
I did, of course. It's a fact. However, my particular school, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, I would call centrist. It's a school of international relations, and we studied everything from international security, and that group of faculty were actually kind of conservative, to development, gender, and some of the other specialties where I think they were quite progressive. As a centrist myself, and I should point out, I'm a registered independent. I've never endorsed a political candidate. I've never made a political contribution. And at this point in my life, I'm not planning on doing any of those things. So I'm a centrist. And I think that was
as evidenced by our initial discussion.
Precisely. And so I felt one of my roles as dean was to try to bring people together and work together. And by the way, Doug, and I don't need to tell you this, we need to do that in America.
Yeah.
Our greatest challenge is not Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. Our greatest challenge are the divisions in this country. And I don't care where you are in the political spectrum, whether you start the morning with Fox and Friends and wrap it up with Sean Hannity, or you start with MSNBC, Morning Joe, and you finish with Rachel Maddow. I don't care where you are. You ought to be worried about these divisions. And what we ought to do about it, my view, not to be political, is try and find candidates who are Republicans and Democrats who are willing to work with each other and solve problems. And they exist. And I think
they exist, but nobody listens to them,
to some degree, that's true. It feels that way at the moment. On the other hand, I lived 5 years, as I just mentioned, in Massachusetts, most liberal state in the country, sometimes referred to as the People's Republic of Massachusetts. Who was the governor all 5 years? Republican, Charlie Baker. And by the way, every year he was voted the best governor in America by the other 49 governors. So
didn't Vermont also have a Republican governor?
I don't know that. That would really surprise me. But
I thought there was a Republican somewhere in there.
Anything's possible.
Yeah.
My congressman during those years was a Democrat named Seth Moulton. He ran for president briefly, veteran, combat Marine, and someone who has made a real mark reaching across the aisles and working with others. Yeah. So I think such people exist, and I think in the hearts of many politicians are the desire to do that. They are somewhat concerned as they look at the extremes in both parties. It's a real challenge for America, and we're going to have to figure out ways to get past that.
It is a challenge. I just came across in a book the Lincoln quote. Maybe it was in your book. I've read like 4 books in the last week, and one of them had this Lincoln quote that he gave at a speech in a university in like 1838, saying the danger will come from abroad. Yeah. It will not come from abroad. The danger will spring up among us, and we will either live forever or die by suicide.
That is a Lincoln quote. He also said, all the armies of Europe, led by the greatest commander, by a Napoleon, could not take a single drink of water out of the Mississippi River as long as we stand together. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty powerful line. And I believe in that. And I think we will find our way back to an environment where we're not screaming at each other about what we disagree about, but rather having sensible conversations, finding compromise. I think we can get back to that.
Yeah, I hope we definitely need to turn the page on some topics and some people, and hopefully just
100%
get there. But
and by the way, one of the backstories in 2054, as you know, is exactly this: the divisions in the country which lead to edging up towards civil conflict, and ends up with Marines in the Capitol, and that's very conscious on the part of myself and my co-author, Elliot Ackerman. Mm-hmm. And I'll make this point. By 2054 in the novel, there is no Republican Party. Mm-hmm. There is no Democratic Party. These two parties have dissolved, kind of reformed. I think we're ripe for that level of political change over the next 30 years because my daughters, who are millennials, and their husbands, also millennials, they just look left and right and shake their heads at the extremes in both these parties.
Yeah, not to spoil the book, and we'll get to that in a bit, but there is a moment in there where there's this sort of insurrectionist moment, and this character who is very well formed and rational that you're rooting for is very credibly on the fence about what to do.
Correct.
And, could kind of go either way, and you could sort of get behind either way there. So it's just a really well-crafted moment in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, the idea in the book is not to give the reader cheap and easy solutions. Yeah. This is not Tom Clancy. Good guys, bad guys. Good guys win in the end, usually in the last 15 minutes. This is real life. It's real characters who are struggling to decide what they're going to do.
Joe Cannon, who was on the show a while ago, if you ever read any of his books, like the Good German and things like that, but he talks about the best thing, the most compelling thing for the reader to experience is not the choice between right and wrong, but the choice between two not very goods, but you got to pick one that's sort of slightly less bad.
Sounds like the election in the United States of America in 2024.
There we go. That is not spoken like a running mate, but so I wanted to, this is a good way to get into leadership, which is a whole topic I want to cover with you, because not only have you walked the walk, but you've taken time to write about this topic.
Thank you.
And including one of your books, Sailing True North. And I wanted to ask you about one of my favorite books that I ever read, which you probably have read, because based on our discussion before we even got going here, you're a big reader in addition to being a writer, but Endurance about the explorer Shackleton.
Ernest Shackleton.
Yes, whose boat, called the Endurance, gets essentially stranded. And one of the things they do so well in that book, I'm sure there are a few, but the one I read was called Endurance.
Probably by Carolyn Alexander, I think, is the best of those. But there's 4 or 5 very good Shackleton
That might
books.
be the one. This one really explored the topic of leadership and characteristics of leadership that are better suited to different circumstances, and sort of broadly stroking it in 2 different groups. There are leaders who are great in a crisis when there's no time for subtle diplomacy. You got to get people and assets moving ASAP. And then there's leadership in a time of relative non-crisis where it's more about consensus building and buy-in and things like that. And in the example of this book, Shackleton was one of these rare cases who exhibited both characteristics of that kind of leadership. What are your thoughts on that topic and specifically, and then leadership more broadly?
Let's start with Ernest Shackleton. This is an extraordinary story. His ship, as you mentioned, the Endurance, is on an expedition to the Antarctic. It gets crushed in the ice pack. So he's got 140, himself and his shipmates, who are literally stranded on ice in Antarctic. And this is 100+ years ago, so there's no communication. They're all obviously going to die. Shackleton rallies them. He exists in the moment of crisis by moving them as a group to a different location. They construct a small, tiny sailing ship out of the shards.
Right. I'd be nervous sailing it across the Hudson River.
It's unbelievable. and he sails at 800 miles of open ocean to get to the nearest inhabited island. It's an amazing story of endurance, which of course is the name of the ship, but it's also resilience. It's calmness. I always think the essence of leadership in crisis is making time slow down. And the way to do that is never raise your voice, never gesticulate, never push people physically, don't get in people's faces. These are the opposite of what normal human responses in crisis are. And we've all been in crisis, and the normal response is to go high and hard. It doesn't work. You've got to slow things down. And the way to do that is recognizing the challenges, but also calmly approaching them and convincing people to go with you. That's Shackleton. And in terms of a second point of leadership, think of the American Navy after Pearl Harbor. So here we are on a quiet Sunday morning in 1941, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet is basically sunk at anchor in Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Our battleships, the absolute centerpiece of the Pacific Fleet, are gone. They're on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The President, Roosevelt, recognizes the leader he had in place for peacetime is the wrong leader for a war. So he immediately gets rid of the current commander, a man named Husband Kimmel, who was, your point, a beautiful diplomat, right out of Central Casting, 6'4", beautiful silver hair, the perfect admiral. That guy gone. And he brings in Chester Nimitz, who's this kind of gritty submariner, missing one finger from an industrial accident.
That's in the Diesel book.
I bet it is. And a German Texan from the plains of Texas. And he found his warrior. Same with the classic example of this is the Civil War, where Lincoln goes through 7 different generals till he gets to, that kind of fat, schlubby guy in the corner that drinks too much named Ulysses S. Grant.
He's our wartime chief.
He's our wartime guy.
Yeah.
And so
what a gift of leaders to be able to recognize who's got the right characteristics
exactly
for the right
moment.
point.
And the heroes of those stories, by the way, are not Grant or Nimitz. The heroes are FDR and Lincoln, who made the tough choice to say, I'm sorry, you're gone. I need someone who can fight this war. That is the essence of,
or maybe in some respects even the British people, because Churchill is perhaps not the man for all seasons, but he was definitely the man for that season.
100%.
He was
correct.
a wartime chief.
Yeah. And some would say, sadly, he was ousted at the end. He eventually came back as prime minister, but he was a leader who meant the moment. And I think that finding that person and putting them in place is the skill of the overall leader. And in this case, your point, it's a good one, is that it was the British people that found their way to Winston Churchill.
Yeah. There's a great Churchill quote. You and I are both fans of Churchill, so we could probably do this all day, which we won't, but I will do one more, which is long after World War II, Churchill was going to run again, and a journalist came over that met him for a drink in a pub somewhere. I was like, Winston, you're kind of above all that. You're like, you saved the Western world. Why would you put yourself through this? They might not even elect you. You could lose. Like, just be like sort of a guy for all parties and be above it, and just sort of be for the British people, like a monarch. Don't go party. And to which he responds, "I fight for my corner, and I keep fighting till the bell is rung."
Great.
Apologies
line.
for the horrible.
No,
Churchill
I think it was
impression.
excellent. There are so many things one could say about Churchill, but for our moment in time, I'll give you a quote and then I'll conclude with what I really admire about Churchill. The quote is, in this era when we are so concerned, appropriately, about the rise of authoritarian regimes, Churchill was asked, well, what about democracy? Can democracy prevail? And Churchill said, I won't do the accent. Churchill said, democracy, it's the worst form of government, except for all the others. That's a pretty powerful line. The thing I really admire about Churchill, though, was his skill with the pen. He was an extraordinary writer.
Fiction too, like you, fiction and nonfiction.
He wrote a novel called Savonarola, which is eminently forgettable, but he was a Nobel laureate. Think about that, to be someone who, as you said, saves the Western world, but also wins a Nobel Prize in literature, deservedly so. I'll tell you, when I lock up as a writer, and everybody locks up, I'll pull a volume of Winston Churchill, and I'll just read a couple of pages.
What's one to recommend to the audience?
I like the 6-volume treatment of the Second World War. It's just called The Second World War.
The one's called The Gathering Storm.
I was just going to say the first one is called The Gathering Storm, and that's the one that I often pull down. It's so evocative of that era of standing on the brink of real disaster. And oh, by the way, as you look at the world today, one could say it's a bit of a gathering storm.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that stuff too, but I want to ask you about one other of your books first before we get into the current novel. One other nonfiction book called Sea Power, which you published in 2017. I have not read it, but it's next on my list because I did look into Alfred Thayer Mahan's 1890 book called The Influence of Sea Power, which influenced every navy around the world.
Correct.
Mainly Germany really was influenced by that. So is this an updated version of that in some ways?
That's part of the effort of Sea Power. The subtitle of Sea Power is The History and Geography of the World's Oceans. So what I do, I make each of the world's oceans a character in this book. So I talk about the Pacific Ocean, I talk about the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and so forth. And I walk through the history and the geopolitical implications of each of those geographies. Alfred Thayer Mahan did something like that, but the final chapter of my book, Sea Power, attempts to pull all that together and create a 21st century version of Mahan's ideas of sea power. So it is a bit of an homage to Mahan, by the way, who was a brilliant writer, a powerful strategic thinker. And
an American admiral, I believe, right? At a time when the U.S. didn't have much of a navy, but his book influenced the British Navy, which was far more powerful. Without
question. And he was also, however, here's the punchline, he was kind of a mediocre ship handler.
Oh, really? Yeah,
and he actually got a bad fitness report, which
you have to be an admiral to give this criticism, by the way.
I do, and I'm happy to do it. He got a fitness report in which one of the lines was, this guy had published like 5 books, as you just indicate, all brilliant, best-selling. The Kaiser of Germany put a copy of his book on the influence of sea power on history in every German warship. But in his fitness report from the U.S. Navy was a line which was, "It is not the business of naval officers to write books." Amazing. My beloved Navy. Anyway, Alfred Thayer Mahan is an iconic naval officer.
Yeah. Well, speaking of your book and looking at the geographies that are out there for the Navy, dipping a little bit before we get into 2054 into speculation.
Mm-hmm.
What is the future of the Navy in 100 and 200 years going forward? Because when I look at the futuristic shows, there are no submarines and PT boats. It's Star Trek, and we're out in the next frontier.
I think that even over the next 50 years, we're going to see a premium on unmanned vehicles at sea. And we see this in the Black Sea right now, Doug. Here is the Russian Black Sea Fleet, 60 frontline warships, capital ships at the start of the war. Today, 25 of them are on the bottom of the Black Sea. Yet, Ukraine doesn't have a navy. Ukraine sank them using drones, unmanned vehicles, exquisite intelligence. That threat to surface ships, ships on the surface of the sea, is real, and it's coming. So I think the future Navy will actually be subsurface. It'll be more nuclear powered. It'll include unmanned subsurface vessels, but they will be linked to satellite systems that provide them the broad area concern. And those submarines can surface, attack, subsurface.
All as a drone type performing vehicle.
And by the way, today, a nuclear submarine is the apex predator of the ocean.
Wow. God, in a way, because I've done a lot of reading around World War I, in a way, the more things change, the more they say the same, because the Dreadnought, the British feared battleship, launched in, I think, 1906, and everyone was thinking, this castle at sea, it's the next thing, it's going to take over the world. And then, fast forward just a few years, and submarines come out, and they're like, oh, the battleship's over. How can you stop that? The battleship's defunct. It took, a few decades, I think, but...
It did, and again, back to 1941, the U.S. Navy's battleship line at Pearl Harbor, 7 of these magnificent, unstoppable, quote, invulnerable, unquote, ringed with steel battleships, all 7 of them on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. And by the way, great book recommendation on this is Robert Massey's Dreadnought.
Yes.
Which is a fabulous unpackaging of the idea of the Dreadnought itself. Jackie Fisher, Winston Churchill appears, all powerfully packaged.
Massey's amazing. And in fact, Castles at Sea is a term I stole from Massey, which is the title of one of his other books.
I know. And that's what reminded me when you said it. His other great book is Nicholas and Alexandra, about the last days of the Russian Empire.
Yeah.
And I often recommend that to people who say to me, Vladimir Putin, is his grip on power unshakable? Well, he thinks so, but Nicholas thought his grip on power was unshakable. How'd that turn out? He was shot to death, long tragically with his family, in a dirty basement in the Ural Mountains. Things can change quickly in Russia. That's a good book to read in the context of today's
the Russian
Russia.
people are a unpredictable and really, like, not to say it's sort of so flippantly about a population, but it's got a violent history.
Correct.
It's sort of this Eurasian country that's got more than 100 nationalities, more than 100 languages in the sort of what was the Russian Empire then, now sort of Russia now.
And a declining population, high levels of alcoholism, drug use, an economy that's a one-trick pony, oil and gas. John McCain used to say the Russian economy is a one big gas station. That's not a prescription for big success in the 21st century. I don't like Russia's chances, broadly speaking. Yeah. But do we need to stop them in Ukraine? Yeah, we really do.
It's funny. People forget that Russia is, I think the average person forgets that Russia is a huge oil. I mean, it is similar to, like, the whole Caucasus region is
absolutely
one big oil well.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect people don't appreciate about Russia is its population is maldistributed. only 150 million in an area much bigger than the continental United States. And all of them essentially live to the east of the Ural Mountains, where Moscow is located. Siberia, this huge land area, it's the size of the United States. In that vast area, nobody lives there. Maybe 20 million people in an area the size of the United States. But what is there? Oil, gas, timber, fresh water, arable land, diamonds, rare earths. Guess who's looking north and thinking about that? Beijing.
All right. I have some lightning round questions for you around our greatest threat. So let's come back to that. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about 2054, which is a terrific read. It's the sequel to 2034, in which there is a global calamity and war. So can you set the stage for the opening of 2054? Because we're kind of post-war at this point.
We are. Both the United States and China have been diminished by this war. Political parties have shifted. There's a new party in place in the United States called the Dreamers. And the president of this party is now in his third term. He stayed perhaps a bit too long. He's given a campaign speech. He collapses. There's attempts to hide what has happened, but it becomes clear quickly he's died. Flash to the autopsy scene where his body is being opened by a coroner and his heart is removed. And the physician holds the heart of the president who's died and looks to compare it to the X-rays provided on the screen, looks back at the heart, looks at the X-rays, and says, "This can't be the heart of the president." What has happened? That's the first mystery in the book. Who killed the president? Why did they kill the president? How did they kill the president? Clearly, some form of remote gene editing has been used here to alter the basic composition of the human heart. Everything I just said is the first 20 pages.
Yeah.
And then we evolve into a political crisis that follows from this.
So we'll tiptoe around spoilers, but what you touched on there, I think we're safe to say this, is the singularity.
Yes.
Which talks about the evolution of technology and biology converging, basically. Yes. And so that you can basically update someone's genes remotely, like you're updating an iPhone almost.
Yeah.
I'm going to broadcast an update, and then I can affect a population with an So, maybe you could vaccinate a population, so that would be a good use of it, maybe. But you could also use it for nefarious purposes as well. And so this becomes almost like the next nuclear arms race.
Yes.
It becomes Oppenheimer-esque. So you also explore the scientists who are working on this in this sort of competitive race, like the nuclear arms race.
Yeah. Let me start by just explaining in one more layer of depth the singularity in a way that I think people can understand it. Singular, you're right, is about one. It's about the coming together of the biologic, your mind, your desires, your nervous system, your proclivities, your memories, everything biologic that you carry around. And alongside that, tech, the internet, chips. Today, how close are they? Well, go walk around Manhattan and look at everyone walking with a phone 6 inches from their face. The internet is right there.
Right there.
Not quite in us yet. So step 2 of the singularity, Elon Musk exploring this now, is an implant in your brain that connects you essentially to the internet. It could do 1,000 marvelous things, including, for example, to allow you to speak any language because your brain would be wired to just do it. That's probably 10 years away.
Oh my God, that's only 10 years away.
Absolutely.
I can just I can just speak French as I think English.
Mais oui, c'est possible. I already have the French chip in. Step 3, 2054, is the singularity has occurred. We can take Doug's brain, your memories, everything, and we can implant you on a chip. And therefore, by one measure, you can live forever. That's the singularity. And yes, the process of getting to it will convey enormous geopolitical advantage on whatever nation gets there first, because by using and controlling the singularity, you can conduct acts of extreme malevolence. You can kill a president from 1,000,000 miles away using the internet, or you can conduct acts of extreme benevolence. You can shift a population to take it away from a direction it's heading that is dangerous.
This reminds me of a conversation we had with another writer who was on the show, who's the tech writer for the New York Times. And she had a book out that was talking about AI and facial recognition. So in this case, the chip wasn't all the way in the brain, but it was in a set of glasses.
Yeah,
so you could put on the glasses, and you would walk in and it would say Admiral James Stavridis. He was Supreme, which, by the way, is an amazing title. Supreme, anything with the name Supreme in it is a good title.
Yeah, although once you've had that title for 4 years and then you go home, you're no longer the Supreme. But you say to your wife,
honey, please.
Please call me Supremo. It just doesn't work.
Fly.
Yeah.
So she had this book out about facial recognition technology. It was exploring some of this. You could wear glasses that gave you all these information. As whatever you looked at, it could tell you everything about it, including people. Because it would recognize their face. And out of 1 billion faces, it would know that you're the admiral. And she had this term in the book that goes all the way back to Oppenheimer working on the bomb, which is technical sweetness. And it refers to that feeling of euphoria that a scientist or an inventor feels as their invention advances, and that feeling of euphoria then overwhelms any sense of caution that, should it advance? Maybe this isn't such a good thing. So you have characters in the book who do not suffer from technical sweetness. And they're, so that sort of sets up some of the tension of the novel. And not to give too much away, but you're very aware of this issue, whether it's Oppenheimer or AI or...
Yeah, I think as we look back on human history, and we can find a number of points where technologies emerge that manifest, I love the term, with sweetness. And there is or ought to be a cautionary point, but ultimately there's an understanding of the benefits. One I always refer to as people run around and collapse in a fetal position about AI is the printing press. Think about the printing press. At that time, all knowledge was confined to a tiny group of monks, scribes, and the few royal protagonists that had access to it. The printing press should have scared the hell out of the nobility because it was going to take knowledge and make it widely available. And so you could spin the argument that a printing press where everyone gets a book and can read things and learn things was highly dangerous. But I think today we'd all agree a printing press was an amazing, amazing invention that helped us on the way to the Industrial Revolution, which is the next example. And you could flow through to the atomic. We think of the atomic bomb, but think about atomic energy and where that ultimately will take us. A lot of the solution to global warming, my view, is in nuclear power, fusion technology. It's coming. And that brings us to today's world, internet, AI. All of these technologies, Doug, have a propensity for violence and danger, but also a propensity to advance the human condition. And the trick for us as humans is to find and take and nurture the good while we suppress the bad.
Yeah. The issue, of course, is the technologies advance so fast.
Yeah.
And one of my big eye-opening moments as an adult, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, these congressmen, they're so smart and what an elevated, exalted position. It's like, then I grew up and I'm like, oh my God, they're such dummies. Like, I don't have any faith in these people to figure out the ethics of AI before AI screams past them at light speed.
I think all we need to observe is a classic hearing where we bring the leaders of the tech companies in and the Congress attempts to interrogate them, and it becomes clear quickly that the congressional protagonists have no idea what they're talking about.
They're trying to read their staff's notes like, wait, what?
And like Mark Zuckerberg, who's, not the most flexible or immediately emotive person I've ever encountered. He's trying to suppress laughter based on what he's hearing.
The idiocy of the questions coming at him.
It's just amazing.
Well, let's talk just a moment about your process, your writing process, which is always a block we do in the show. How different for you between fiction and nonfiction? Very
different. And I may never write another book of nonfiction.
Really?
Yeah, I've become very enamored of writing fiction. I mentioned earlier this idea that you can kind of splash a lot of paint around the canvas. Secondly, you just reach a wider audience. You know, I could have written a narrow book about a war with China, nonfiction, or a book about AI and the dangers and the benefits. You know, 5,000 people would read that book, maybe 10. Writing a big novel like 2034 is north of 500,000 copies. It's in 22 languages. You're just reaching a much broader audience. And then third and finally, when you write fiction, you are telling the story with characters. You bring in real people. And I think all of us learn best when we're told stories. And in particular, we learn best when we are following a character. And so I think it's just a more powerful way to move ideas. So I'm very committed to writing fiction from this point forward.
There's a famous Kipling line, if history were told in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten.
That's a great line.
Which is a good one. I totally agree with that. How about the research you've done, whether it's fiction or nonfiction?
In all cases, because of my 37 years in the military, I have this deep baseline of experience over many, many years. I continue to hold high-level security clearances in my role as a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. I hasten to say I would never reveal anything classified, but it can inform what's real, what's impossible. It helps you frame ideas. Thirdly, I have access to very senior people on both sides of the aisle in government I interact with constantly. So I have a nice appreciation. Fourthly, because of my international background as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, before that, Commander, Southern Commander, I know many senior non-U.S. people. So I have a very strong baseline that I can draw from as I write these novels that help me parse between what could be, what might be, and what could never be.
Well, it comes through on the page in the book, of course. And you actually even have a line in the book that I loved and underlined, which is, it gets to the idea that you can fool the ref. You know, it's sort of a sports metaphor. You can fool the ref, you can fool the coaches, the fans, but you can't fool the players.
Yeah.
And, you know, you and your co-author on this book, Elliot Ackerman, are the players. And you just reference your experience and your authority on what's happening in the story really comes through. How do you and Elliot, speaking of your co-author, how do you guys split the work and how do you work as a co-authoring team? Yeah,
and it's quite rare. If you Google co-writers or dual writers of novels, there aren't very many. A few, interestingly, as part of Cold War fiction. You see some in the 50s and 60s, but it's relatively rare. Interestingly, in a nautical sense, the writers of Mutiny on the Bounty, famous nautical novel, obviously, were co-written by two. The way Elliot and I do it is I kind of sketch out an outline. I put a kind of short paragraphs of detail into the outline. I send that to Elliot. Elliot kind of looks at that and says, I'd rather do this. Here's a different character. He sends it back. We agree on the outline. And then Elliot typically will take the first crack. He's a more experienced novelist than I am. I think he's on his fifth or sixth novel. I'm on my second. So I bow to his greater mastery of fiction, and he takes the first crack, gives it to me, and then I make changes. Typically, he'll put in like a bracket that says, insert high-end battle at sea here. So I get to do that. Or he'll say, for example, insert autopsy scene, the one I described to you earlier, and I'll do that. He knows I have two son-in-laws who are physicians. So we'll then bat the chapter back and forth till we're both happy with it. Then we go on to the next chapter. And these books are very short. They're very readable. They're about 6 chapters. They're very character driven. Yeah. And Elliot and I sort of see the world in very similar terms. And so it's been a joyous collaboration, really very, very few points of contention ever.
So the editing sort of goes back and forth. You edit each other, and then it goes off to an editor, and they have some feedback to smooth out maybe slightly different writing styles or anything like that, or not really?
Not really in terms of writing style. Our editors at Penguin Press, Random House, world's largest publisher, have been non-intrusive. They're comfortable with the product we're providing.
Great.
And so we have a very collegial relationship with our editors.
How about some of the weird technical questions?
Sure.
Like, do you have a favorite place to write? As the Admiral, I imagine sort of a big mahogany desk in a room with ship models around you. And
I'm a stand-up desk kind of guy, so I have a stand-up desk. I do have ship models. I have a model of the carrier Enterprise, which I commanded as part of a carrier strike group. I have a model of the destroyer Barry, USS Barry, that I commanded as a very young officer in my late 30s. I have a model of HMS Victory, Lord Nelson's flagship. So yeah, I've got a few friendly ships around me. And I have books. I have 5,000 books in my house, many signed first editions. I'm a bibliophile, and I'm most comfortable writing when I'm surrounded by other books. So that's where I do my writing.
That's actually where I get half my character names. I look at the spines of books, and it could be,
idea.
That author's first name and the other one's last name or something like that.
It's a great plan.
So as you sort of referenced your access to classified materials before, you mentioned you're writing not predictive fiction, but speculative fiction.
Yeah.
But you've had access, I'm sure, to files that are, military files that are trying to predict what's going to happen in China, what things are going to look like in 10, 20 years. So if you were to go back at those over your career, read something from 20, 30, 40 years ago, are there things that were spot on, and was there anything that was sort of laughably off?
Yeah. Let me start with a quote from Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, who, before he became Secretary of Defense, spent 35 years at the CIA, ending up as the director. I think he's the only person to walk in the door at the CIA at an entry-level job and emerge as the director of the CIA. Point being, he knows a lot about intelligence. And he was asked once about our ability to predict things. And he said, yeah, we got a perfect record. We always get it wrong. And I think wildly off, going back, say, 50 years ago, would have been that we were going to build a security strategy in the Middle East around the Shah of Iran. We really missed that boat. 50 years ago, we dismissed China. Even 20 years ago, we largely dismissed China. We missed the rapid rise of China. And
why is that, do you think?
I think there's a component of it that said the Soviet Union in the Cold War context and then the Russian Federation were just much more dangerous. I think another way to put it is we defaulted to what we had comfortably dealt with. Number two, China had not made the defense investment. Even 20 years ago, they had a relatively limited number of nuclear weapons, for example. I think we tend to emphasize the size of a nuclear arsenal. So Russia has today 6,000 nuclear weapons. China just has a few hundred nuclear weapons, approaching 1,000, but they're building that up rapidly. I think we overweight nuclear weapons as a metric, not putting enough attention on conventional shipbuilding, for example, which China does extremely well. And then third and finally, there's a component of, it's Asia, it's a long way away. How dangerous can they be? It's a geographic blind spot. The British have an expression, sea blindness, meaning that you tend to just think that threats a long way away, across the horizon, out of sight, you're blind to those, sea blindness. I think there's some of that in how we looked at China. Whereas Russia was always on our doorstep being defined as NATO because of our engagement with NATO.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, coming out of World War II, China was basically a colony. You know, everybody's like had a piece of it. And suddenly it's, you know.
Yeah. You know what Deng Xiaoping said to Henry Kissinger was Kissinger said, well, you know, China, you've had a long and storied history, but, you have a lot of growth to do. And Deng said, we've had a couple of bad centuries. Don't count us out. That's a pretty good line. And it's really true of China.
Yeah. No, it's a massive population.
Exactly.
And it's got ambitions.
Indeed.
Yeah. All right. Before we get into the lightning round, I would love to know what's next. I know you're with the Carlyle Group, so you've got a business side of things. You're probably still involved in the intelligence and military communities and of course, writing.
Personally, my sort of twin towers of my life. One is I'm a partner and vice chairman global affairs for the Carlyle Group, which is a big financial house. About half of our work is private equity. The other half is private credit, financial advising. So point being, I'm very involved in international finance. That's my full-time job. My give-back job that I really enjoy and love is I'm chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. Historic, iconic, the first true humanitarian foundation created in the United States by John D. Rockefeller. And we are deeply involved in electrification in southern India and sub-Saharan Africa and 1,000 other things. So those are kind of my main pursuits. In terms of writing, Elliot and I are hard at work on the third volume in this trilogy. First was 2034, about a war with China. Second, 2054, about artificial intelligence, civil conflict, as we've talked about. And the third one, and yes, it is an homage to 1984. The third volume is 2084, and it deals with climate. It deals with the repercussions if we fail to address the climate challenges that are bubbling now. And if we don't, by late this century, the global south, which will be extremely disadvantaged by climate, think sub-Saharan India on fire, think Indonesia uninhabitable, late this century, that global south will want land and reparations. For example, Greenland. Greenland has, by this point, become fertile, entirely inhabitable. Why not give that to the population of the global south?
So the like south of the equator will get it worse than north of the equator?
No.
Or just
around
close to the equator?
Correct.
Yeah, okay,
north and south of the equator itself will become a band of devastation if we don't get global warming under control. And the hypothesis in 2084 is that will create geopolitical conflict, and it sets up with a massive battle fleet from Indonesia, Brazil, and Nigeria steaming north to claim Greenland.
That's good. So you and Elliot are turning drafts on this now?
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
2084. I think it may be the best of the three books, but stay tuned and enjoy 2054.
Now, that would be a spoiler. I was going to ask if any character from 2054 can live 30 more years. But
I can. I'll tell you that. Yes, is the short answer. I mean, the three books are a multi-generational trilogy, and no character obviously goes from 34 to 84. But there are characters who come along in the course of this who are children of progeny. And so the three fit together, I think, pretty well.
Oh, that's great. It's going to be a nice box set.
Yeah, a box set, exactly.
Okay, well then on to the lightning round for Admiral James Stavridis. Your favorite book as a kid?
If what you mean by kid is, kind of a preteen, early teen, I think you do, Lord of the Rings. Read it so many times, loved it. And by the way, Wall Street Journal asked me to name 5 great books of geopolitics, and I gave some pretty conventional nonfiction, The Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides. Book number 5, The Lord of the Rings.
That's interesting.
It's a book of powerful geopolitics.
Not only did I read that as a kid, but I tend to reread it every 5 or 6 years.
Absolutely.
And I heard the story that David Benioff was pitching Game of Thrones to HBO, And they're like, this sci-fi weird thing. He goes, no, it's not sci-fi. It's politics.
Correct.
Yeah.
He's absolutely right. And some would say it's a shadowed version of World War II. Sauron as Hitler, Saruman as Mussolini, the hobbits as these sort of innocent buffoons wandering around the world, and then the Gondor and Rohan, the Alliance, and all of them in the search for the nuclear weapon, the ring.
Right, yeah. Oh my gosh, he was ahead of his time.
Way ahead.
Let's see, book or books reading now?
I am reading something by Don Winslow, who's a novelist, who is, I think his best thing is a trilogy about the border. It's called The Border, The Cartel. But he then wrote a trilogy. The final book of this new trilogy is out, and it's about an Irish mafia, Italian mafia gang war that starts in Providence, Rhode Island. The scene shifts in the second book to Los Angeles. The third book just came out. It's called City in Ruins. It's set in Las Vegas. It's the culmination of this trilogy. Here's the Easter egg. It's all based on the story of Aeneas, the founder of the Roman Empire. It's incredibly well written and a very clever novel in a lot of dimensions.
Do you need to start with the first one?
I think you should, honestly. The first one is called City on Fire. That's the start of the gang war. The second one is called City of Dreams, when the survivors, the Irishmen, who are the Aeneas of this population, fleeing Troy, go out to Los Angeles. And then in this third and final City in Ruins is Las Vegas, where he becomes wildly wealthy, but his past comes after him.
Oh, I'll check it out. I saw where he announced his retirement as a result. Most people just stop writing, but he's like Philip Roth. He's like, no, I'm going to retire and do a book tour.
I'm not sure that's going to work out for him. Yeah, I'm not sure that's going to work out for him, but I wish him well.
He seems too young to retire.
Way too young. Yeah. Way too young.
All right. Well, thank you for the recommendation. Movie that best captures life at sea.
I think this one's very easy. It's Master and Commander. Russel Crowe. It's set in the early 1800s during the Napoleonic War, based on the novels of Patrick O'Brian, a series of great sea novels. And it's a sailing ship with a crew that bonds and argues and goes back and forth, and it captures that tiny universe of a ship at sea.
That's great. One of the underrated Russell Crowe movies.
It's a beautiful, and it was nominated for several Academy Awards.
So maybe appropriately rated.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful film, and for life at sea, it's quite good.
Cool. Well, from hearing from you, I think I need to go watch it again just to make sure I catch up.
And by the way, the music in it is gorgeous, and there's very little dialogue. It's like The Last of the Mohicans. Go watch that movie again, both directed by Michael Mann. It's both films are told with visuals and music, by and large. And
that's an interesting point. I love that movie, Last of the Mohicans.
It's gorgeous.
As you say that,
and same with Master and Commander. Yeah. Same style, same director.
Okay, best war movie of all time.
So many. Old-time one is D-Day. John Wayne is in it. It's black and white. It's a little cliched to the modern eye. I think Saving Private Ryan for land warfare is as gritty and as real as it gets. For a Navy guy, for a maritime guy, the most recent version of Midway. Woody Harrelson plays Nimitz, and it's about the U.S. Navy's comeback after the Battle of Pearl Harbor. We're defeated, destroyed. We come back and win the Battle of Midway. It's a gorgeous film about war at sea.
You and I have a number of connections here because our family went to Normandy last year, and in preparation, on the advice of numerous people, we watched D-Day with John Wayne and Saving Private Ryan.
Perfect. Those are the exact right. If your question had been the D-Day invasion, those would have been the two movies to watch. In terms of war at sea, certainly Midway, the most recent version of, is very powerful. And another one to deploy another film is Greyhounds, which is Tom Hanks. I think it's on Apple TV, but it's a movie. It's about a convoy operation in the North Atlantic, very different than Midway. That is also extremely realistic on the battle between submarines and destroyers trying to protect merchant ships.
So your answer to that question is much more sincere than your co-author, who was on the show a year ago, and to the same question replied, Tropic Thunder.
That would be Elliot.
Which is another movie that I also love.
Yeah, not so much, but keep going.
Back to the more serious line of things. What is the most terrifying moment of your military career?
I think two kind of come to mind, one in peacetime and one in war. Peacetime, I'm making a transit through the Suez Canal, and we pull off to one side to let northbound traffic go by us. And the ship, my ship that I'm captain of, and I'm exhausted at this point, is, I don't know this, but is headed toward running aground. And luckily for me, one of my young officers, a navigator on the ship, literally grabbed me and said, Captain, we're about to run the ship aground, drop the anchor, stop the ship. And in that moment, my entire career hinged. And I followed his advice. We dropped the anchor, but it was, as I reflect on it, I realized how close I came to not having the career that I
Would that have been enough if you ran aground?
I would have been
done.
fired immediately.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah, flown off the ship. They would have given command to the second in command. Standard Navy protocol. We take accountability pretty seriously in the U.S. Navy. A wartime incident of many, going back a ways, was combat in the Arabian Gulf with Iran. A moment where I was the tactical operations officer charged with the firing keys and being ready to launch missiles on a cruiser. And I saw on the radar what I thought was an incoming Iranian vessel, aircraft, probably armed with cruise missiles. And I locked it up with our fire control radar. And I was literally 1 second from pushing the firing key and shooting it down.
When you say locked it up with firing, is that like what I'm imagining is Top Gun, you get tone, you hit the button,
correct,
something like
that? Exactly. So the radar was completely focused on this flying object, and all of my sensors said, missile lock achieved, press firing key. This is 1987, and I had literally had my thumb about to press down when a voice behind me said, I'm getting IFF off it, interrogation friend or foe, meaning was a commercial aircraft.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Did you find out what it was in the end?
Yeah, it was an Iranian Airbus full of civilians. A year later, the Vincennes shot down an Airbus in the same circumstance in 1988. That was a moment I'll never forget.
Wow. Did you ever see the movie Crimson Tide?
Of course.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. Yeah. And you know, Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington, think about putting those two together in a film. And I think it is also a film where there's no easy answer there. There's no simple solution to this idea of the captain's authority. And I think the film does a good job of laying out the ambiguities that you deal with, which I think is why your mind went there as you thought about it.
There's like chain of command, but then there's also like
human
and
instinct.
that moment is like,
Correct.
boy, if we hit that button and we're moments away from hitting that button, it changes the world.
Sure. And here's the other point. What if I hadn't hit the button and it turned out it was an Iranian F-14 that launched a missile and killed 200 crew members on my cruiser? There's no easy answer, and there's no pat answer to any of those moments. Those are two that have stayed with me.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing those.
You bet.
Well, final question. One piece of advice for the audience.
I could give you 1,000, but I'll give you one, which is, may or may not surprise people, but it's physical fitness. You know, I went to the Naval Academy. I played 2 varsity sports there, tennis and squash. And I've always had a culture of trying to stay in shape. Once you lose physical fitness, it's, I think, incredibly hard to get it back. I've worked really hard to maintain it, and it is something that will pay you great benefit, not just in longevity and health, but in energy, in decision making, in sensibility, how you are with your family. Working out makes a big difference in life. And by the way, you don't have to go to the gym 90 minutes, bench press, sprinting. Find ways to build a good level of physical activity into every minute of your life, and you'll benefit from that extremely.
Great. Admiral, it's really an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Next time we'll have a Boulevardier instead of this Negroni.
Deal.
Do it in the winter. Perfect. Cheers.